Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher. This week I'm delighted to be able to talk with Dr Byron Sherman, who is Head of Cognitive Education at Roedean School in Johannesburg. Byron is a colleague of mine and we have many fascinating conversations in the staff room, and it felt remiss not to share some of these conversations with you. So without further ado, straight over to the interview which we conducted on Teams. So, Dr. Byron Sherman, it's great to have you here on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about some of the big questions in education. I think a lot of the time we are so consumed as teachers by the small questions that we don't stop and think about some of the bigger questions. And for me, one of the biggest questions of all is the whole question of inequality. We have a two-tier education system, and I think that's true all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
One for the people who are destined to become the decision makers in society, and the other for the rest of it, the rest of us, the water carriers and hewers of wood amongst us in the new digital and information economy. But so I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say about all of this. So what is your background? What your teaching experience and educational background? I know you're a Harvard man.
Well, yes, I will save my name drop for just a little bit later, but I'll tell you what happened before that. I first want to say thank you so much for inviting me to come on your podcast. I feel tremendously honored. It is the first podcast I've ever participated in, so it's a new experience for me, and tremendously excited to be, in a sense, continuing the conversations that we often have about these and other issues. So I started off wanting to become a writer. And as many wannabe writers do, I assumed that if I took English literature, this would magically transform me into a writer, or at the very least, someone who could teach literature and write on the side. And then I got into, when I finished honours in the late 90s, my first job was teaching English as a foreign language to Chinese adults and children in Johannesburg. So my story with China goes back a long way. And then I did that for a year, and then just purely by chance, I happened to secure a post at the National School of the Arts. And so my teaching career really started there. And it was a somewhat unusual path because I didn't actually have a teaching qualification. I'd gone the academic route and got honours in English literature. So I was figuring out how to teach and kind of on the job. And I'd sort of started to do that at the Chinese school. But of course, when you go to a high school, that's a whole order of magnitude, different and more challenging. And I started at the school in the middle of the year, 2 weeks before the June examinations, when the students and the parents were thoroughly irritated because they hadn't had a teacher for a long time, and there was a lot of unhappiness and dissatisfaction, wailing and gnashing of teeth. And so it was a tough situation to come in. And the other thing was I was a very young teacher, and I was thrust into teaching senior students, grade 11s. And in fact, one of our current colleagues was in that very first group of grade 11s that I taught. Okay, sorry, I've just got a message that has come up here on Teams. I hope that hasn't affected your side. All right. So I became an English teacher at the art school, and it was then that I really fell in love with teaching because I immediately became one of these teachers that was very curious about the individuals in my class as well as how to reach them. And so because I was thrust into this kind of situation of massive uncertainty, I began to reach for all kinds of educational theories and ideas in order to kind of theorize what I was doing. And it was actually an enormously beneficial thing for me in the long run. So I stayed at the art school for 7 years, and that was really the forge in which I kind of became a teacher. And I also pursued various projects. During that time, I was involved a lot with student leadership projects and training, and I also developed various programs for the students on the brain and how to learn and nutrition for the brain and all these different things. And I'd kind of get them into school sometimes on a Saturday morning or in the afternoons to chat about these things. And so I was pursuing this sort of interest in the brain and learning and neuroscience. And then in 2006, my mom passed away, and I decided that I wanted to go abroad. And a friend encouraged me to apply in America because he was living there. And so I thought, well, I'll start at the top and work my way down. So I had a look at the Harvard website, and I discovered a program called the Mind, Brain and Education program.
Right.
And I thought, well, in for penny, in for pound. This is exactly what I've been doing all these years, this attempt to bring neuroscience and cognitive science and all these things into the classroom in a more decisive kind of way. And I thought I'll email the professor in charge and introduce myself and give him a bit of my background and ask him, am I a suitable candidate for this? And I was very surprised and immediately had a huge case of imposter syndrome when he replied a few hours later and said, yes, you're exactly the sort of person we want on this kind of interdisciplinary program. And I forwarded your details to our program advisor, and she will be in touch shortly. And I thought, goodness me, they must have made a mistake, but it turned out that they hadn't. And I basically was given the most wonderful support over the next 18 months, as well as getting a scholarship and other things, all through this professor and the folks at Harvard. And I was then able to go to Harvard in 2007. And so in September 2007, in a year that I was teaching matrics, which was not ideal, I then packed up my house and sold it and went off to the States for a year to do a master's degree and had an amazing time there. And then returned to the art school the following year for a few months before pursuing my long-standing goal of actually going to China. And so in December 2008, I arrived in China, and I remained.
Can I ask what the draw was to China? Why China?
Well, it's a kind of sentimental childhood thing, a connection with China that went back or just an interest in China and in other countries of East Asia, culture, language, traditions, martial arts, all these different things as a child that always stayed with me. And somehow I always would have Chinese or Taiwanese people in my life, along the way. So there was always this connection going on. I thought, now is finally the opportunity to go and kind of live out this dream of exploring what's happening in China. And the other reason was that having been on the Mind, Brain and Education program, I was very interested in what sorts of developments were happening in China because they were in the process of doing a lot of educational reform. They were doing a lot of research. A lot of the decisions they were taking at that stage were very kind of data driven. And I thought this is really interesting to go and see an education system in the process of transformation. And I had thoughts of doing a PhD at that stage. And so I was interested to go and see what was going on. And I also wanted to learn the language. So I wound up in China, initially in a language training school as part of a franchise in a small city called Wuxi, which is near to Shanghai. And then I eventually transitioned into the university system and taught mostly in universities for the 14 years that I was there. During that time also learned Chinese, taught myself Chinese to read and write and speak Chinese, and eventually then pursued a PhD in kind of literature translation studies, you could broadly say, also areas that I'd studied literature, but I hadn't studied translation formally. I hadn't studied Chinese formally, so I needed to do a lot of background work on that. And then the last 9 years that I was there, I pursued a PhD through WITS, but doing all the research in China. And then again, not on the mind, brain, and education thing, although that continued to be an interest, but more on the literary translation, history sort of side. So that in broad strokes is the story. And then I arrived at Roedean last year, as you know, and fell into this playpen of new challenges. So I hope that's an adequate summary.
More than adequate, and I mean that it seems to me that you must have been quite a trailblazer, because brain-based learning was not a term being bandied around back then. Yeah.
So when I got back to South Africa in 2008, there just wasn't anything like that at that stage. And it's interesting that, as we both know, Roedean started down the road of thinking school and all of that in 2009. So it was filtering in, clearly not to the government school system at all, but into good private schools already at that stage. And so I was delighted when I was looking to come back and discovered that there was a post at Roedean called a head of department cognitive education, because I thought, wow, this is really progressive. And I thought this is absolutely the sort of thing that I would like to do. So yes, it obviously has evolved very rapidly in the time that I was away from South Africa.
And what are your thoughts about, the differences between education systems in China and over here? I mean, you talked about the Chinese system going through transformation. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I must say that in many instances, my kind of naive optimism and enthusiasm about the possibilities of transformation in China were, I was ultimately rather disillusioned because the system, first of all, the Chinese education system has its roots in a at least 2,000-year-old tradition. And during much of that time, you had scholar officials who would take, examinations in order to enter the scholar class. And it was, in a sense, innovative in the sense that if you were not necessarily from one of the privileged classes in society, through your own effort and study, there was at least a small chance that a poor kid could get into the education system even hundreds of years ago and become a scholar official. So there was a bit of a slight possibility of upward mobility. In reality, as we have in the current situation, if your parents are well educated, you're much more likely to access a better education as well. But so that system was based a lot on rote learning and memorization of the classics. And that, interestingly, has translated itself into the modern Chinese education system, which is based overwhelmingly on memorization of what teachers say, rote learning, and recitation, actually as something you would do, for example, in a language subject, or basically regurgitating information in examinations. And there's tremendous cultural and economic pressure on that system to remain as it is. So the innovation that happens at the fringes. And so there are interesting experiments going on in China, and there have been interesting experiments going on. But essentially, that's the system. You have high stakes testing at various stages in a child's career. You need to be tested to determine which middle school you're going to get into. And then from middle school, you might be then from primary school to middle school, and then from middle school to high school, there is another big assessment. And then to get into the right university, you then take what's called the Gaokao at the end of what we call matric. And that's an intensive, I don't know if it's still currently in this form, but a 3-day examination in which you're tested on all the subjects that required and chosen that you've taken. And then that determines your destiny in a way, because if you can get into a very good university, you have a much better chance of securing a very good job. And so there's tremendous pressure on students to deliver in this very high stakes testing system. And in the context of that, the only way out is to go to an international school where you essentially, if your parents have enough money, you can remove yourself from that system and get another kind of matric, maybe through a Cambridge qualification or whatever, and then you're essentially out of the system. And then the idea is you would probably go to university in another country, because without the Gaokao, you can't really get into Chinese universities usually. So there is innovation. There are what are called experimental schools at all different levels. At kindergarten level, there are experiments in bilingual education, English and Chinese at kindergarten level. There are all kinds of people doing research and, that are interested in innovations that are happening elsewhere in the world and trying to implement them in China. And there's certain cities where more happens. So in the top tier cities like Beijing and Shanghai, you find more education innovation there. But the system ultimately is a little bit hamstrung by the tradition, the culture, and the enormous money behind testing, teaching, and providing extra classes to allow students to get through this very competitive system.
Which is based mainly on rote learning, from what you're saying.
Based mainly on rote learning, yes.
So what happens to critical thinking? Is that discouraged, or is there a route for that? I mean,
my impression, having been there and been in many classrooms with Chinese teachers, is that you find individual teachers who try to encourage a degree of that in their students. But the truth of the situation is it's not rewarded within the system more broadly. So the idea is that you don't normally ask questions in a classroom, or you keep questions to a minimum, and the questions that are asked are very functional sort of questions, more than actually why are we doing this inquiry-based sorts of questions. And there's a curious thing in China where the teacher has so much authority that if the teacher explains something poorly, culturally, the students will often blame themselves for not understanding and find fault with their own listening or comprehension ability rather than with the teacher's teaching. So you will find argumentative parents who blame teachers and things like that, and depending on how moneyed the parents are, as is the case in South Africa, you find more or less of those sorts of complaints. But in general, teachers are not blamed, not challenged to justify what they're doing, not questioned in terms of, why are we doing this? What's the relevance of this? How can I use this, outside of the classroom? Those kinds of questions that we, especially in the humanities and in languages, like to encourage students to ask. So at an individual level, you'll find a little bit of that among individual teachers, but systemically, no. Because it's just one step from that to questioning the whole system. And that's absolutely not what the authorities want. They want students to be obedient. They want students to trust authority and to believe that the authority has my best interests at heart. And parents, government, school are all united in terms of approaching the student with an attitude of trust us, we know what's best for you. So the result of that is that many students go into university without actually knowing what they want to study. Other people choose the subjects for them, or they get compelled to choose certain subjects. And then you see this very clearly when they go abroad for further study, that they're at 6s and 7s when they arrive in America or whatever, and they're not used to thinking about their own questions or exploring their own interests. And they find it difficult to deal with supervisors that are saying, well, come on, what is it that you want to explore? What are you interested in? Because they've never really had the opportunity to think about that. I must add a caveat here that Chinese students, contrary to what many people in China believe, are capable of tremendous creativity and critical thinking if it's required of them regularly, and in a way that makes sense to them. So if classes are too open-ended, especially initially, there's a lot of stress and kind of a sense of what's expected of me here. But if you create a structure for them and you introduce the structure and you run it over a period of time, they become comfortable with it, and then within that they start expressing their opinions, and they actually can become quite argumentative and critical, which is very enjoyable to see. This obviously happens mainly in an English classroom with a foreign teacher.
Right, because it's more the expectations of the code are, this is going to be somewhat different.
Yes, but it takes them a while to realize that the teacher genuinely wants to know what they think.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, they have no reason to believe that you care about their opinion when they arrive there for the first class. And so you also have to deal with, this is very common in Asia, with a lot of silence. So long periods in the class where you've asked a question and nobody says anything. And, you have to hold your nerve as a teacher. And over time, you realize that silence is not always, I don't want to participate. It's that I'm trying to figure out if you really want to hear from me. And then later on, I'm really trying to figure out what I want to say. And it's taking me time because you're asking me to do it in a foreign language. And if you just hang tight, what I found is over time, I would get more and more contributions, even from students that weren't normally very talkative. But we needed periods of silence in the class where I didn't freak out and go and give them the answer or anything. But I just made it clear, this is my expectation and I know you can meet it.
Yeah. Are there any strengths to the Chinese system?
Yeah. Very good at embedding basic skills. So reading skills, Chinese students learn to read both in English and Chinese quite a good level. I think from quite a young age, although obviously comprehension in English, I think will lag a little bit because it is a foreign language compared to comprehension in Chinese. But, the decoding skills, the ability to read words and to to pass them, and that they at good schools they'll get that very early. Maths, obviously, they are way ahead of most Western countries. So the basic skills and routines of mathematical thinking, they've got that waxed at a very young age. And science, the ability to work with scientific concepts, they tend to be quite good at that, I would imagine, within a certain range. I'm not sure that they would be able to apply scientific concepts freely, but they understand them well enough to, be able to answer those sorts of questions on international assessments very, very well. So they come with a very, a very solid basis in a range of skills. And the other thing they have is from a young age, they're taught to be quite self-disciplined. So they're usually quite good at organizing themselves. They know that they need to do homework. They know how to, organize themselves from a young age in terms of that. They know how to behave in class so that the learning process can happen, because very often you have classes of 40 and 50. And it amazes me sometimes that any learning can happen in an environment like that. And that students sitting with a desk mate directly next to them and another people on this side and that side and surrounded by books and whatever, that anything can happen. But it does happen. And it's because they are socialized to tolerate other people in their environment from a young age. And, to actually be able to focus despite all this additional stimuli going on in the background in the environment. I mean, it would drive me mad to be a student in a class with 50 people, but they do it. And I'm sure it is difficult for them, but the training from a young age really does make a difference. So I would say they get the basics of being a student down pretty well. And if they then get into a more progressive system and they realize that something different is required, very often they excel because they don't need to get the other stuff in place that some of our students are still struggling to get in place at grade 10 level or whatever. So there are some strengths to the system.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me in the West we're obsessed with blooms, and especially with higher order thinking, the
Yes.
analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, often at the expense of putting in the memorization and things like that are foundational to critical thinking.
Right.
So are there things within the Chinese system that might be usefully employed in Western schools to actually improve critical thinking?
Well, I think, even just the small thing of not having this kind of cultural distaste for anything that smacks of rote learning. Because in our culture, I think especially since the 60s with progressive education movement and student-centered learning, all of which is very valuable, we've kind of reacted against earlier traditions like grammar translation method and things like that, and seen that as authoritarian by their very nature. And so we're kind of confusing the education method with what we take to be the spirit behind it, the kind of authoritarian teacher-driven thing. And somehow that's linked to anything that involves memorization or repetition or whatever. And so I think with the Chinese, that aversion is just not there. And so they're able to use that as an option, whereas I think a lot of teachers instinctively recoil at a task that involves anything like that, except maybe foreign language teachers in schools who know there's certain things that absolutely have to be drilled. There's no other way to do it. So I think, I'm not sure that there are many things I would take out of their system, but the one thing I would take is, I think, firstly, this understanding that rote learning has a place in certain parts of the curriculum, as long as we're not doing that all the time. And secondly, I think in terms of really focusing on the skill of being a student from a very young age, and actually helping students to understand what it is to be in a class and to work with other people, and what sorts of behaviors we can classify as intelligent behaviors, given that you're working in a collective and you're not only thinking about yourself, you're thinking about the good of the collective as well. And you should be thinking about that. And I'm not sure we do that enough. I'm not sure that we teach, or we require of even young kids this awareness of everybody needs to learn something here. Everybody needs to benefit from this experience. So in terms of managing your impulsivity and things like this is something you absolutely should do, not only because you might get better results ultimately and have a better relationship with your teacher and peers, but because other people learning around you will benefit from that. And there's, we've become very individualistic, and I think that idea of my responsibility to the collective and inculcating it from a young age in a positive way, perhaps in a less kind of authoritarian way than the Chinese do, but in a positive way, might be something that we could take from them. If you go to Chinese universities, you find students living in dorms, a single room with 6 to 8 other people. I mean, this is astonishing, how anything can get done in that sort of claustrophobic environment, and how they don't kill each other. And there are conflicts and things that happen, obviously, but there's a sense of, I need to be accommodating to others, and I think we're losing that in Western societies, certainly. It's very much about me and what things must be set up to suit me. So I think there are things on that level that we can learn.
Some golden mean somewhere in between.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
I think one of the big problems in education is we tend to set things up as dichotomies. And
yes,
if you're going to go a constructivist route, then there can be no lecture method in teaching, and
right.
that's that's totally false.
No.
Just because you construct knowledge in your own head doesn't mean that a delivery method that's highly effective might be a lecture or reading a book or being disciplined and so on.
Right. You want to be able to draw on a variety of tools.
Yeah.
And so which tools, why should we exclude a tool for ideological reasons, essentially?
Yeah.
When it could actually be very worthwhile.
Yeah. So I'd like to kind of end off by going back to the original question at our two-tiered education system.
Yes.
With schools like Roedean, for example, where the children largely of the elite are being educated, concentrate on things like critical thinking. But can we take any lessons from situations like that and apply them to the vast majority of schools in the country?
One thing that I think is useful about the Chinese system when it works is that the Gaokao, the final matric exam, really is a potential ticket to a better life for people who are from a disadvantaged background. And so you, of course, if you're the child of an official or a big businessman or whatever in China, you're going to have a better education, generally speaking, and therefore a better chance of, and that's everywhere in the world. But there are kids who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds who really do access the middle class through the Gaokao system. And China, when it works well, the education system does identify kids who are talented and capable despite very disadvantaged circumstances and brings them through. And sadly, I think in our society, the matric exam works much less in that way. It's not a guarantee of, that to the extent that it is in China. And that's a very sad thing. You know, in South Africa, we really are in a situation where you grew up and where you are educated is going to determine almost your whole life. Your chances of getting out of that situation through education are quite minimal. And I think that has to do with obviously with things like not enough resources and teachers that are not trained as they should be, and poor school management and corruption and other things. And sadly, very often education budgets that are not spent even. It's not that they're being misappropriated, they're just literally not used. We spend this enormous amount of money kind of on in terms of our education budget, and we don't get much in return for that. So I think the answer really is, capacity building in those schools in disadvantaged communities, and that it really becomes a focus so that there's plenty of support for those teachers. And through supporting those teachers, there's support for those students so that their ticket to university really is a ticket to something better potentially. But then in the broader framework, we know there are enormous problems with youth unemployment, even for graduates in South Africa. So that's job creation in general needs to happen. But I think if we could work on the issue of capacity building in those schools and try to root out the mismanagement, from government side, and really create partnerships similar to what Roedean does with the Roedean Academy, create more of those partnerships between schools that are doing well and schools that need to improve, then we might start getting more of a conveyor belt of students who are escaping their circumstances. Because the minute you get one student who can get into a better job and get a better life, you're uplifting an entire family, potentially even a community, just through that one individual. And that's something which I think they get right in China a lot more than we do here, and something that we can certainly learn from.
Yeah. So once you've taken that entrance exam into university, are the universities largely free? I mean, it wouldn't be a barrier.
I don't think they're free anymore, which is kind of contrary to the whole socialist principles. But they do function. Many universities do function like businesses as well. So there is a lot of that going on. I think for those poor students, however, there will be opportunities to access scholarships, and because their talent is acknowledged and seen as an asset to the country and the state as a whole. So the other thing about China is that there's something which simultaneously I admire and also kind of I'm horrified by, is this idea of human resources. They have a word in Chinese, 人力资源, which literally means human resources, and that's also what they would call in business. But this idea of human beings as resources for the country, and that's uppermost in their minds. It's not only about what are you going to do in terms of your individual life, but how are you going to contribute to the society? And so from the level of the state, there's a lot of emphasis on we need to develop our resources. And I think just that attitude immediately creates the possibility that more people are going to get through despite their disadvantaged circumstances, because there's a focus on getting them through, not only for their own self-actualization, but for the benefit of all, the entire society. And we don't have enough of that in our country. We don't have enough of, like I said earlier, the sense of responsibility to the collective. I think we have it in patches, but we don't have it systemically.
Yeah, it's everyone for themselves.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Byron. It's been fascinating talking to you, and I suspect we're going to need to have another interview to cover the wealth of topics that I would have loved to have covered, but we just don't have the time. People don't have the attention spans for 20-hour videos. But
As long as you don't produce a whole lot of TikTok moments out of this podcast, I'm quite happy.
I will never sync to TikTok.
All right, Dorian, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you, and I look forward to more conversations.
Absolutely, and thank you, Byron, for
Great
agreeing
pleasure.
to speak to us.
Thank you.
Thanks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, share with your colleagues, and please leave comments below. Byron has raised so many interesting points, and it would be lovely to see what you think. Well, bye for now, and see you again next week.